Welcome to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to talk about what happens in the immediate aftermath of the battles at Lexington and Concord. As we talked about, Lexington and Concord is kind of the start of the Revolution. It's the first military altercation between these colonial militias and British regular soldiers. Immediately after Lexington and Concord, this large militia army followed and chased the British army all the way back to the city of Boston. But once they got there, kind of nobody knew what to do. No one was in command of all these militias. They weren't really sure kind of what their next step was going to be. So what they did was they surrounded Boston. You can see Boston in the middle of this map by fortifying themselves. That means digging trenches and other things in the hills surrounding the city. And so this militia army is kind of just waiting to see what is going to happen next. And so a major battle has not yet occurred. It was only the small ones at Lexington and Concord. But immediately after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress is called, where representatives from all 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia to discuss what they're going to do next. After Lexington and Concord, this could be considered an act of war, and so the colonies need to get together to figure out what their next move is going to be. And the first thing that they do is they adopt the militia army and they rename it the Continental Army. So now, kind of these ragtag militias that had come from all over Massachusetts, they're now considered to be the Continental Army. And since every army needs a commander, they appoint George Washington, the hero of the French and Indian War, to command this army outside of Boston. Like I said, there hadn't been a major battle yet in the Revolution, but that major battle was about to happen. The British inside of Boston weren't really that happy about, being trapped there. As you can see again on the map, kind of the hills surrounding Boston mean that if they wanted to get out, they would have to fight their way through this Continental Army. And so what the British did was they gathered up reinforcements, which arrived by boat in Boston Harbor. Believing that the militias were poorly trained and wouldn't stand up to any sort of an assault from trained soldiers, they actually gathered up their soldiers and they attacked the militia army at a place called Breed's Hill. So actually the Battle of Bunker Hill took place at a place called Breed's Hill. But we call it Bunker Hill because that is just the way that it's been named. And so the Continental militias were staring down the face of a large assault up this large hill from the British. And the commander of the colonial militias gave the order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And if we think about why he would say that, it's pretty easy, if you think about who these militias were, to realize that their main concern here is going to be saving ammunition and making every shot count. And so that was the order given, and it became a very famous kind of saying, symbol to come out of this Revolutionary War. And so at Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, the British charged straight up a very steep slope twice. Two major British assaults went up this hill. But both times, the Continental Army stood their ground and pushed back the assault. But eventually, after those two attacks, the Continental Army was forced to retreat and leave Boston, not because they had lost the battle, but simply because they ran out of ammunition and had nothing left to fight with. So the Battle of Bunker Hill can be considered a loss for the colonies because the Continental Army was pushed out of Boston and they had to lift their siege of the city. But it's extremely important for a couple of key reasons. The first is that these colonial militias, who were considered to be poorly trained, poorly equipped, and not capable of beating the British Army in any sort of battle, much less a war, had stood their ground and held against British soldiers in two major assaults. Because of this, the colonists begin believing that they have a chance to win a war against Great Britain. Also, the siege of Boston is going to continue to a certain extent because they weren't actually able to completely move the Continental Army off of all of these hills. But probably the most important part of the Battle of Bunker Hill was the fact that the British are going to lose 1,000 soldiers in this fight. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you take into consideration that kind of in the whole Revolutionary War, only about 25,000 soldiers are going to be lost for this army, it's a very large number. And the commander of the soldiers in Boston, General William Howe, said immediately that this success is too dearly bought. and these large amounts of casualties become a scandal in Great Britain. The idea of war against the colonies was already unpopular, but after 1,000 people have been killed in this war, it is going to become even more unpopular in Great Britain. And so public opinion is going to turn against kind of this war in Britain from the very beginning. So now that the revolution is underway, now that kind of some battles have happened, let's kind of get the overview of how this war is going to go. First, let's talk about the Continental Army, the army that's going to represent the colonies who are later going to become the United States. And this Continental Army has a couple of advantages. The first is the home field advantage. The idea of the war is being fought on kind of American soil, and so they have support from that. Also, it's the idea that they are fighting for a cause. They're fighting for rights, freedom, independence, and people fighting for a cause are going to be much more willing to sacrifice for victory than those who aren't. Also, the Continental Army is going to use unconventional tactics. They're going to employ guerrilla warfare. They're going to attack British supply lines. Their goal is not necessarily to fight these big pitched battles with big lines of soldiers, but they're going to try unconventional tactics to basically drag out the war and make it very costly for the British. However, the disadvantages make the Continental Army seem almost comical. Almost none of these soldiers had any formal training, meaning that basically they were a bunch of people with muskets who didn't really know how to fight as an army. They were a very small army. Again, there's only 2.4 million people in the entire colonies, and not all of them are going to fight. It's a much smaller army than British's army. And they actually don't even have a navy. At this time, the Continental Army doesn't even have one ship that they can use to attack the British Navy. They're also going to have supply problems. They don't have factories to make ammunition, food, and other things that you need to fight a war. So supply-wise, it's almost comical kind of the amount that they're going to have because it is so little. Then finally, they don't really have a strong central government. And this is going to cause problems because when the Continental Army needs support and funding for their war, it's going to be very hard to get from that Continental Congress. So now let's take a quick look at the British Army. And the British Army is going to have a lot of advantages, but the colonies are going to have to focus in on their disadvantages. Britain's advantages, they're considerable. The first is that they're a well-trained and experienced professional army that had recently won a series of wars against other powerful European countries. So this army and navy was considered to be the most powerful on earth at this time. The British also had industry. They had resources, they had money, and so supplies were never a problem for the British. The British never had to worry about running out of ammunition, clothing, food, any of those things. Also, Britain had a strong central government, which meant that when things were needed for the war, the government would be quick to respond to those needs. But the British Army coming to this war has a couple of disadvantages. The first is they're fighting in some unfamiliar territory, which is going to give the colonists a slight edge in some of these battles. They also have very long supply lines, that all their supplies, their ammunition, their food, their blankets, their uniforms, they have to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, a journey which takes several weeks to complete. Also a disadvantage. The soldiers are fighting, they're professional. They fight for pay, they fight for the king. They are really uninvested in this war compared to the colonists who are going to be very, very invested in the outcome of this conflict. And then finally, there's going to be really weak support for the war on the home front. The war is going to be unpopular amongst the British people and amongst British Parliament, and so eventually that is going to wear down the will of Britain to keep fighting this war. So on paper, this one is a no-brainer. A lot of the people who did not support independence, they were called loyalists. The main reason that they didn't was because they thought the colonies had no chance against an army like Great Britain's. And on paper, they're right. If Britain brought down the full force of its army and navy on the colonial army, they probably would have been defeated fairly easily. But the colonists come up with a strategy to win this thing. They have almost every disadvantage, but if they focus on Britain's weaknesses, then they have a chance to win this thing. The first part of this strategy is that they're going to look at the fact that Britain's main weakness is that the war is unpopular in Great Britain, that there's not a lot of support for this war among the people. And so, in order to try to exploit that weakness, the American colonies are going to try to drag the war out as long as possible, making it very expensive in both lives and money. We call this blood and treasure, to further weaken support for the war in Britain to try to get them to end the war. Then the second weakness is that Britain had a lot of enemies, and so they looked to exploit European rivalries by trying to get help from other European countries to basically enter the fight against Great Britain. And so this strategy to try to focus on Britain's weaknesses is actually going to be a very effective one in winning this Revolutionary War. And a great example of kind of one of the benefits of the Americans in this fight is the story of Nathan Hale. Here in the picture you can see he's a man who's about to be hung. Nathan Hale was a spy. He was only 21 years of age, and he was captured, and the punishment for spies, for espionage, is death. And so right before he was about to be hung by the British for his role as a spy for the Continental Army, he said, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." And this kind of brings up the idea that wars are not just won on paper. Things don't always just come down to the amount of men or money or resources that you have, but it can also come down to the power of belief. Because those who are willing to sacrifice more for victory are often the ones who win. So let's get back into the war a little bit and talk about kind of the early stages of this. Britain actually didn't have a lot of soldiers in the American colonies. So because of that, the Continental Army had a lot of early success. Bunker Hill was a great moral victory. They had stood their ground against the most powerful army on earth. Also, patriots in the southern colonies are also going to win big victories in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina throughout 1775 and 1776. However, this is because Great Britain has not yet sent a full army to attack the Continental Army. So the success is going to be short-lived. So the fighting had already started. There were soldiers in the field. There were battles that took place, but the colonists were still split on the issue of independence, even though the war had started. A lot of people thought there would be a chance to kind of reconcile and kind of walk back the war and return to basically life as just British colonies in the Americas. And so in this sense, we can almost consider the Revolutionary War in some ways to be a civil war, in that Americans were split on the issue of independence. Those who were loyal to Great Britain, who wanted to remain a part of the British Empire, were known as loyalists. And they had a lot of very good reasons why they wanted to stay with Great Britain. And on the other side were the patriots, those who wanted the American colonies to become an independent nation. And arguments were made on both sides that were compelling. And so Americans split on this issue. So in some way we can consider this war to actually be a civil war as well. But now we're going to leave the battlefield to go to Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress is going to start debate whether or not the colonies should declare independence in the summer of 1776.